Now, the supply chain and logistical changes seem overwhelming at times. There seem to be a lot of moving pieces. So can you briefly explain the steps in that process?
Well, the supply chain, of course, started with setting up the manufacturing process, which was, in fact, the second step in what we've done in Warp Speed. The first step was actually to do the research and development of the vaccine, design them, test them in the clinic, etc. But in parallel, we set up the manufacturing. So the overall supply chain, from deciding to start manufacturing a batch of vaccine to releasing it from a quality control criterion, takes between 2.5 and 3.5 months. You have to use your fermentation, growing cells, for instance, etc., which produces the vaccine. And then you have to purify that vaccine, and you create what's called the drug substance, which you then have to run a lot of tests on that you have set up prior, of course. And the vaccine, the drug substance batch, needs to pass all those quality tests. Then you have to take that drug substance and you formulate it. For instance, if I take the currently approved vaccine, the messenger RNA vaccine, you have to embed the RNA, the messenger RNA, into a lipid particle. That work takes, again, a few days. And then you have to fill the vaccine that's now ready into in sterile processes into the vials. And then again, you have to run quality control tests on that finished vial that usually take between 3 weeks and 4 weeks. And then you can release the vaccine. And then you can distribute it once it's approved and then immunize. So it's a long process, many, many steps, many tests. Sometimes a test can fail or can give an unclear result. You have to repeat it, which makes planning the supply chain for vaccines extremely difficult, particularly when you have no stock that can help you to smooth down the ebbs and the flows on your capacity to produce batches.
Now, you've mentioned the process of prioritization. There is some concern as to whether or not people are going to be able to skip the line, as it were. What is in place? First, to begin with, do you have any concerns about that? And if not, what is in place to try to avoid that outside of the guidelines?
So, frankly, the operation, the approach we took has been to actually connect with each state in our 50 states, with the governors and the health teams within each state, and they tell us where to ship vaccine, to what hospital or facility or long-term care home, etc., and how many vaccine doses to ship there. We expect and we hope that at that level, which is really much more granular and clear about who should be vaccinated first, there will be no opportunity for people to jump the line. I think it would not be a civic thing to do. But unfortunately, from where we sit, we have no view really on who actually gets the vaccine. It will be each state that decides that and controls it.
And what can you tell us about how we should advise our patients? And then I want to talk a little bit with you about the Moderna decision today.
Sure. I think I'm going to set the stage by just saying that, like any vaccines, the Pfizer vaccine can cause side effects. And in their clinical trials, the side effects were mostly mild or moderate. They went away in a few days, but they included pain at the injection site, tiredness, headache, chills, and fever. And frankly, for healthcare systems, we're recommending that they take this into account when they're planning for vaccination of their staff. For example, you wouldn't want to vaccinate everybody on the COVID ward on the same day and then have a large proportion of those people just not feel great the next day. So we know that there are side effects. In the clinical trials, there were no significant safety signals found. But as large as these trials were, there's still only tens of thousands of people. And that's why CDC and FDA do not stop monitoring vaccine safety when a vaccine is authorized or licensed. We have incredibly robust systems, And we launched these systems as soon as the vaccination program was launched. Since vaccination started on Monday, we've identified several cases of severe allergic reactions or anaphylaxis reactions in people who have received the Pfizer vaccine. And these are similar to reports that we've gotten from the UK. And we are still actively investigating this. In the meantime, we're recommending that people who have a history of anaphylaxis to vaccines or injections should be careful and consult with their healthcare provider. Everyone who receives this vaccine should be observed for at least 15 minutes after vaccination. If you have a history of anaphylaxis due to any cause, you should be observed for 30 minutes.
Whether or not if you were African American, or whether or not you had a chronic disease, or whether or not you were obese, did we see any differences in the side effect profile in the Pfizer study? I know that they had about 3,900 African Americans or Blacks in that study. Did we see any difference?
We saw no difference in race, ethnicity, obesity. One thing to know, though, is that people with certain underlying illnesses were not included in the study. And that is pretty much normal practice to sort of make sure that you pick a population where, you can understand their side effects. So every iteration that you might think of somebody who looks exactly like you, they may not have been precisely in the study. And that's why it's so important that after the study is over, we continue to monitor for safety. We're going to be looking for exactly those kind of signals to make sure that nothing unexpected occurs.
And relevant to the agenda for tonight, you are also the co-chair of the Biden-Harris Transition COVID-19 Advisory Board. Do you have any tips for how we can more successfully overcome some of these barriers that we're facing in getting our patients to enroll in clinical trials and for vaccine acceptance?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is really one of the top priorities for us now in the advisory board. I have the pleasure of co-chairing along with soon-to-be Surgeon General Vivek Murthy and Dr. David Kessler, bringing together really a phenomenal group of scientific experts. And we're working with policy teams that have been kind of at this from the campaign and before. We know that we have a challenge here in terms of communication, messaging, really just general understanding. What's been lacking is some federal coordination, quite frankly, around that. People have questions about safety, efficacy, even cost. We should be addressing those head on. Moreover, right, we need to make sure there's representation, not just in the clinical trials key, but at every sort of decision-making point. And really there has been, and people need to be reassured about that leadership and how that's different today than it has been historically. So we have work to do without question to make sure healthcare providers in particular have the information they need to make decisions about their own vaccination and for their patients.
You explained what the CDC Foundation does and their role to combat this pandemic.
Well, I thank you for that. And I'm glad we're able to sort of clarify. So the CDC Foundation is an independent nonprofit that was actually created by Congress to support the CDC's life-saving and public health infrastructure work across the US and around the world. We are a nonprofit. We are linked to CDC in name and in our focus on supporting public health and in their work, but we are a separate entity. And I would say that in terms of responding to the pandemic, in January, the CDC Foundation activated an emergency response fund to provide support to the rapidly emerging needs that people were seeing and were identified as being necessary to address COVID-19. So those funds were used to meet needs that were identified both by the CDC and the work that they were doing, as well as by local and state health departments and what they needed to respond to the health threat. So this included things like PPE for frontline workers, providing laboratory and medical equipment. The foundation hired over 1,000 surge staff to deploy in health departments across the states and territories. These are epidemiologists, lab professionals, really seasoned public health folks to add on to the public health workforce that already existed.